What if everything you think you are isn't really you? Wait, don't close this yet, because what I'm about to tell you in the next few minutes might be the most uncomfortable thing you've heard in a very long time, and also, quite possibly, the most liberating. There's something almost nobody says out loud. Something most people have been carrying since childhood, without knowing exactly what it is, without being able to name it, but feeling it all the same. That sensation that there's one version of you that performs, that smiles at the right moment, that says what's expected, that works to achieve what you're supposed to achieve. And then there's another version, quieter, more real, watching all of that from the inside and sometimes wondering, when did all of this begin? When did I stop being myself and become what other people needed me to be? That question has an answer, and it's much older than you imagine. Before we continue, I'm going to ask something of you. I need you to stay. Not because this video is going to solve all your problems overnight, that would be a lie, and I have no interest in doing that. I'm asking you to stay because what you're about to hear isn't cheap motivation. It's not a list of 5 steps to become the best version of yourself. This is something different. It's psychology. It's philosophy. It's the story of how the human mind builds prisons without bars and learns to call them home. And if at any point you feel uncomfortable, if something I say touches something inside you in a way you didn't expect, that is exactly the sign that you should keep listening. Let's start at the beginning. Not your beginning, but everyone's. When we are born, we come into the world without a formed identity. We are pure experience, pure sensation, pure presence. We have no concept of what's expected of us. We don't know what it means to fail. We don't know what it means to disappoint someone. We are, in the most literal sense of the word, free. But then the environment arrives. And the environment has something very clear to say about who you should be. The first time you were scolded for crying too much, you learned that emotions come with a cost. The first time someone applauded you for doing something well, you learned that approval is earned. The first time you tried something and failed in front of others, and saw something like disappointment on their faces, you learned that failure is dangerous. Not just uncomfortable, dangerous. And so, completely unconsciously, without anyone explaining it to you, without anyone sitting you down and saying, now we are going to build a mask, you started creating one. Psychologists have a name for this. Carl Jung called it the persona, from the Latin word meaning theatrical mask. It is the face we show the world, the version of ourselves we have designed, through years of practice and refinement, to fit in, to be accepted, to survive socially. And here comes the part few people want to admit. The mask works. That's what makes it so dangerous. If it didn't work, we would abandon it. But it works. It gives you approval. It gives you belonging. It makes you feel like you are part of something. And the human brain, evolutionarily speaking, prefers social belonging over almost anything else. Being rejected by the group meant death for our ancestors. So when the mask protects you from rejection, the brain learns. This works. This keeps us safe. Let's continue this way. The problem appears later. Much later. When one day you look at yourself in the mirror, or sit silently for a moment between the noise of the day, or simply lie awake unable to sleep at 3 a.m, and suddenly you feel something strange. A kind of emptiness you don't understand. A tiredness that isn't physical. A sensation that something doesn't fit. That you are living a life that looks fine on paper but feels hollow inside. And the most confusing part of all is that you don't know why. You have a job. You have relationships. You have routines. You have everything you're supposed to have. And still, there's something. Something you can't identify. Something pulsing softly from within, as if it's trying to tell you something you've spent years refusing to hear. That is not a crisis. It is not a sign that something is broken in you. It is probably the healthiest thing your mind can do, trying to remind you that there is a version of you that has been waiting for a very long time. Now I want to tell you something about fear, because this is what truly keeps people trapped. It's not laziness. It's not lack of information. It's not that you don't know what you want. Most people know, on some level, what they want. What they don't know is how to want it without fear. The fear of judgment is possibly the most powerful force operating in everyday human psychology. Not the fear of death that exists, but the brain handles it differently. The fear of judgment, the fear of what people will say, the fear of being seen failing, The fear that someone will discover you're not as capable, as confident, as competent as you appear to be. And this fear has a very particular characteristic. It is silent. It doesn't scream. It doesn't announce itself. It simply operates. It makes decisions for you without you realizing it. It makes you avoid uncomfortable conversations. It makes you stay in places where you no longer want to be. It makes you behave in ways that don't represent you. It makes you say yes when you want to say no. There is an experiment in social psychology that I find fascinating because of what it reveals about human nature. In the 1950s, Solomon Asch designed an apparently simple test. He showed a group of people 3 lines of different lengths and asked them which one matched a reference line. The correct answer was obvious, completely evident to anyone with normal vision. But there was a trick. The rest of the group were actors who deliberately gave the wrong answer. And what Asch discovered was that more than 75% of the real participants, at some point during the experiment, also gave the wrong answer, simply to avoid disagreeing with the group, simply to avoid being the one pointing out something different, simply to avoid looking strange, wrong, out of place. Think about that for a moment. Intelligent, capable people, with perfectly functioning senses, chose to deny their own perception of reality rather than risk social rejection. Now imagine what this means in your daily life. Not in a laboratory experiment, but in the decisions you make every day, in the opinions you keep silent, in the dreams you never mention because you know how they will sound, in the conversations where you say what the other person wants to hear instead of what you truly think. How many times have you done that? How many times have you chosen the version of yourself that creates the least friction, that raises the fewest eyebrows, that doesn't make anyone uncomfortable? And the question nobody asks is, at what cost? Because every time you deny something true within yourself in order to fit in, something happens inside. Not dramatic, not immediate, something small, like a microscopic crack. And microscopic cracks, accumulated over years, eventually become fractures. Now then, here comes the part that interests me the most, the part that has to do with control. Because there is a pattern that constantly repeats itself in people who live trapped inside a false identity, and that pattern is the obsession with control. Not control in the obvious sense. I'm not talking about people who want to control others, though that exists too. I'm talking about something subtler, the need to control how people perceive you. Control the narrative, control what people think of you, control situations so that nothing can catch you off guard. Do you know why people need to control everything? Because they are afraid of what might be discovered if something goes off script. If I control everything, nobody can see what's behind the mask. If I perfectly manage how I present myself, nobody will know what I really feel. If I keep up the pace, if I follow the rules I imposed on myself, if I never allow myself a moment of real vulnerability, then I am safe. The problem is that this is not living. It is performing in a play where you are the only audience member who doesn't know the show is fake. And the obsession with control creates something else. It creates anxiety. And here, science is very clear. Anxiety, in its most common form, does not come from real dangers. It comes from uncertainty. And uncertainty skyrockets precisely when you invest all your energy into controlling things that, by nature, cannot be controlled. What other people think, how they will react, whether you will disappoint them, whether you will be enough. The more you try to control those things, the more anxiety you generate. Because deep down you know, even if you never consciously admit it, that you have no real control over any of it. And that gap between what you try to control and what you actually can control is exactly where anxiety lives. Michel de Montaigne, the 16th century French philosopher, wrote something that has been true for centuries, and yet we still struggle to accept it. He said that the greatest obstacle to knowing oneself is not ignorance, but illusion. The illusion that we already know ourselves. The illusion that what we believe about ourselves is real. Montaigne withdrew to his library at the age of 38, still considered young by the standards of his time, and began to write. Not to publish, not to become famous, not to teach anyone. He started writing to understand himself, to observe himself with the same curiosity a scientist observes an unknown phenomenon, and what he discovered left him perplexed, that he was deeply inconsistent, that what he believed about himself one day contradicted what he thought the next, that his opinions changed, that his fears were not always logical, that the person he believed himself to be was made, to a large extent, of borrowed stories. Stories from his family, his culture, the books he had read, the expectations of his era, and he had the lucidity and courage to ask himself, but where am I in all of this? That is exactly the question I want to ask you now. Where are you in all of this? Because the identity you have been building since you can remember is made of layers. Some of those layers are truly yours. Your genuine curiosities, your deepest values, the things that move you when nobody is watching. But other layers are borrowed. They are echoes of what was expected of you. They are responses to fear, survival strategies that once made sense but no longer represent you. And the question nobody asks, because it is too uncomfortable, is, what would happen if you started distinguishing one from the other? What would happen if you could identify which part of you is really yours and which part is adaptation, mask, strategy? I want to tell you something about stories, because this is where psychology becomes truly fascinating. The human brain is, before anything else, a narrative machine. It does not process reality raw. It interprets it. It turns it into story. And that story has protagonists, causes, consequences, an arc. And most importantly, it has a central character, and that character is you. Cognitive neuroscience has demonstrated something that at first seems incredible but makes more sense the more you think about it. A large part of what we consider our personality is not an objective description of who we are, but a coherent narrative the brain constructs to make sense of our behavior. In other words, you do not discover who you are and then act accordingly. You act first, and then the brain constructs a story explaining why you did it, so that the character you are remains consistent. It is as if you carry inside yourself an internal narrator, working tirelessly, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, whose only mission is to preserve the coherence of your story. And that narrator, with the best intentions in the world, sometimes lies to you. It tells you, that's not for you. It tells you, you already know how these things end. It tells you, it's not worth trying, not because it is malicious, but because it is trying to protect the coherence of the character you have built. Anything that threatens that coherence, any possibility of real change, genuine evolution, is perceived as a threat. And here comes the part I want you to take away from this video. The narrator can be rewritten, not overnight, not magically, not because you read one book or watch one video, although both can be the beginning, but through a process that is both simpler and harder than it seems. Before I explain how that process works, I need you to understand something about detachment, because this word has a bad reputation. When people hear detachment, they think of indifference, coldness, some kind of armchair Buddhism that sounds good in an Instagram quote but has nothing to do with real life. That is not detachment. That is dissociation. Real detachment is something completely different. It is the ability to observe your own thoughts, emotions, and reactions without becoming trapped inside them. It is the difference between being the character in the movie and also being the director who can see the scene from outside. The Stoics understood this. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled the Roman Empire in the 2nd century, and who, despite having absolute power over millions of people, still wrote philosophical reflections in his private journals, spoke about something he called the view from above, the ability to mentally rise above the situation and see it from a distance. Not in order not to feel, but in order not to confuse what you feel with what you are. How many times have you confused an emotion with a truth? You feel shame and conclude, I am a shameful person. You feel fear and conclude, I am not capable. You feel loneliness and conclude, nobody truly loves me. You feel failure and conclude, I am not enough. But shame is not a definition. Fear is not a diagnosis. Loneliness is not a sentence. Failure is not an identity. They are states, temporary, informative, but not definitive. Detachment is not about stopping yourself from feeling. It is learning not to marry every feeling as if it were the absolute truth about who you are. And now, finally, let's talk about what I believe is truly at the core of all this. The reason most people never truly get to know themselves. It is the noise. Not the external noise, though that also plays a role. I mean the internal noise. That constant torrent of thoughts, judgments, comparisons, reproaches, expectations running endlessly through the mind, making it almost impossible to hear something deeper. We live in the age of permanent stimulation. You already know that. But what you may not have considered is what that specifically does to the capacity for self-knowledge. To know yourself, you need silence. Not physical silence, though that helps. Mental silence. The space between thoughts, where you can observe who you are, without the noise of constant narrative. And that silence is exactly what the modern environment is designed to eliminate. Notifications, stimuli, intermittent rewards, infinite content, all of it serves a function, not necessarily a malicious one, but the side effect is that you are never alone with your own thoughts long enough to understand where they come from. There is research in psychology that shows something disturbing. When people are placed in a room without external stimuli for around 15 minutes, with the only options being to sit with their own thoughts or receive a small electric shock, a surprisingly high percentage choose the shock. They prefer physical pain to being alone with their own minds for 15 minutes. That is not a curious statistic, that is a diagnosis. What is there in your mind that scares you so much to encounter? Because the reason people run from silence is not that silence is boring. It is that silence is honest. And honesty, when you have spent a long time constructing a version of yourself that is not completely real, hurts. But here is the paradox. The path toward inner freedom passes exactly through that place. Through the place you avoid. Through that conversation with yourself that you have been postponing. People who have lived through major personal transformations, who have made genuine shifts in the way they see themselves and exist in the world, almost always describe the same turning point. It wasn't a book. It wasn't an inspirational talk. It wasn't a moment of success. It was a moment of brutal honesty with themselves. A moment when the mask fell off, even if only for an instant, and what they found underneath was not what they expected. And instead of putting the mask back on, they decided to stay a little longer with whatever was underneath. Now, I want to talk to you about something very concrete, because I don't want this to remain abstract. How do you recognize that you are living from a borrowed identity instead of your own? There are signs. They are not dramatic. They are not easy to see precisely because the system that generates them also gives you reasons to ignore them. But they exist. The first is inexplicable exhaustion, not physical tiredness with a clear cause, but that deep exhaustion that appears after days that, on paper, should have recharged you. Days where you were surrounded by people, where you went places, where you did things, and yet you reach the end feeling empty. That exhaustion is often the cost of performing, of sustaining the version of yourself that is expected, for hours, without rest. The second sign is irritability without apparent cause. That feeling of being tense, of every small thing affecting you more than it should. That, many times, is not a problem of character or temperament. It is the sign that something inside you is under tension, that there is a part of you trying to say something and unable to find the space to do so. The third, and perhaps most revealing, is the inability to genuinely enjoy things. You can experience moments of pleasure, you can laugh, you can have fun, but there is something in the background observing all of it from a distance, as if you never completely believe it, as if enjoyment always feels slightly superficial. That is not necessarily depression. It is partial dissociation. It is the sign that the person living those experiences is not completely real. And the good news, and we finally reached it, is that all of this has a solution. Not quick, not comfortable, but real. There is something Michel de Montaigne did consistently that modern psychologists have rediscovered under different names. He simply called it essaying. The French word essayer, from which the word essay comes, literally means attempt, trial, exploration without guarantees of outcome. Montaigne did not try to reach definitive conclusions about himself. He did not try to solve the mystery of his identity once and for all. He simply observed himself, asked questions, wrote down what he found, and returned, and continued. That is exactly what modern psychology calls metacognition, the ability to think about your own thoughts, to observe from a slightly elevated perspective the mental processes happening inside you. And this ability, which sounds abstract, has concrete and measurable effects. People who develop greater metacognition are more emotionally resilient. They make better decisions. They have more authentic relationships. And significantly, they have a stronger sense of agency, a greater feeling that they are the ones steering their lives rather than being carried by them. But there is something you need before you can begin doing all of that. Something nobody mentions because it sounds too simple, too obvious. And yet, It is what is most lacking. You need permission. Permission to be inconsistent. Permission not to have everything figured out. Permission to change your mind about yourself. Permission not to be the version you built 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, or last year. Because one of the cruelest traps of fixed identity is that it demands consistency. If you have always been the responsible one, change feels like betrayal. If you have always been the strong one, showing vulnerability feels like collapse. If you have always been the one who never needs anything, asking for help feels like failure. But consistency is not a virtue when what you are being consistent with is a version of yourself that was never completely real. And this is where the concept of rewriting enters. Not in the sense of inventing a new personality out of nowhere. Not in the sense of pretending to be someone you are not. We have already seen where that leads. But in the sense of questioning the stories you take for granted about yourself. I'm not good with people. Are you not? Or did you simply have experiences that made you believe that? I'm not made for this. Are you not? Or did you simply never give yourself the time and space to discover otherwise? This is just who I am. Is it? Or did you learn to be that way because it was what worked in the environment where you grew up? The most powerful word in this process is not I am, it is I have believed. Because what I have believed can be questioned. What I am feels immovable. And that difference, seemingly small, changes everything. I want to tell you something about real success. Not the kind of success that sells. Not the kind that photographs well or generates admiration from others. The kind of success that, when you reach it, makes you feel that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. That is not achieved by following someone else's path. That is not achieved by copying a formula, no matter how well it worked for the person who created it. It is achieved by doing something completely opposite to what modern culture promotes. It is achieved by looking inward before looking outward, and looking inward not once, not on a weekend retreat, not only during a crisis when there is no other option left, but continuously, with curiosity, with honesty, with the same discipline you use to maintain anything else you value in your life. Because self-knowledge is not a destination, it is a practice. It is something you never finish, because you are never finished. You keep changing, you keep learning. You keep surprising yourself if you allow yourself to keep looking. And that, precisely that, is what distinguishes people who feel their lives have meaning from those who feel they are living inside a script they never chose. It is not luck, it is not talent, it is not being born in the right place or having the right opportunities. It is the willingness to be honest with yourself, even when it hurts, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it means letting go of things that have been part of you for a very long time. And now, I want to ask you one final question. Not so you can answer me, so you can answer yourself. If you could speak with the person you were 10 years ago and tell them something about the life you have built since then, what would you say? Would you tell them that you followed your own path? Would you tell them that you stayed true to who you really were? Or would there be something in that conversation that would be difficult to say out loud? I'm not asking you to answer me now. I'm only asking you to stay with the question. Let it live somewhere in your mind over the next few days. Because the best questions are not answered immediately. They are left to settle, left to do their work. Uncertainty about who you are is not a weakness. It is the necessary condition for continuing to discover who you might become. The life you deserve to live is not waiting in the future for you to deserve it. It is in the present, waiting for you to dare to claim it. And the first step, which is always the hardest and also the most important, is not changing what you do. It is changing the way you look at yourself. Stop being the supporting character in your own story. Start there. If you made it this far, comment, "I made it," and I will personally reply to you myself. And if this resonated with you, subscribe to become part of this community and leave a like if you enjoyed it.